Professor Richard Hawthorne had dedicated his entire life to studying Victorian photography at Oxford University. For 37 years, he had examined thousands of 19th-century photographs with the methodical precision of a master detective. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he would discover in a seemingly innocent wedding photograph from 1892 that would arrive at his office on a cold December morning and change everything he thought he knew about the nature of time itself. The photograph came from the estate of a recently deceased collector in Yorkshire, wrapped in brown paper and accompanied by minimal documentation. The handwritten note simply read, "Wedding photograph, Manchester area, believed to be 1892. Family unknown. Please examine for historical significance." Professor Hawthorne had received hundreds of similar requests over the years, and this appeared to be just another routine authentication task. The sepia-toned image showed what appeared to be a typical Victorian wedding scene. A bride in an elaborate white dress with the characteristic high collar and long sleeves of the 1890s stood beside her groom, who wore a formal mourning coat with tails. Behind them, arranged in the conventional formal pose of the era, stood approximately 12 wedding guests in period-appropriate attire. The setting was clearly a wealthy Victorian home, with ornate wallpaper, heavy draperies, and expensive furniture visible in the background. Professor Hawthorne began his standard authentication process, examining the photograph under various magnifications and lighting conditions. The paper stock was consistent with 1890s photographic materials. The chemical composition of the image matched the silver gelatin process used in that era, and the clothing and hairstyles were all perfectly appropriate for the time period. But as he increased the magnification to examine fine details, a process that had become second nature after decades of similar work, Professor Hawthorne noticed something that made his blood run cold. If you think you're prepared for what's coming next, hit that follow button right now, because what Professor Hawthorne discovered will make you question everything you believe about reality. This is just the beginning, and you don't want to miss what happens next. In the reflection of a large mirror, hanging on the wall behind the wedding party, barely visible at maximum magnification, Professor Hawthorne could make out details that should not exist in an 1892 photograph. At first, he assumed it was an optical illusion, or perhaps damage to the photographic plate. He cleaned his equipment, adjusted his lighting, and examined the area again. The reflection was clearer now, and what he saw made him gasp audibly. In his empty office in the mirror's reflection, he could distinctly see someone taking a photograph of the wedding scene, but not with the large, cumbersome cameras typical of the 1890s. The figure in the reflection appeared to be holding a small, rectangular device at arm's length, in the exact pose that anyone living in the 21st century would recognize as someone taking a photograph with a smartphone. Professor Hawthorne's hands began to tremble as he documented what he was seeing. He was a man of science, trained to approach historical artifacts with rigorous skepticism. He ran every test he could think of to verify the photograph's authenticity. Carbon dating confirmed the age of the paper. Chemical analysis verified the photographic process. Examination under ultraviolet light revealed no signs of digital manipulation or forgery. According to every scientific method available, this was a genuine 1892 photograph that somehow contained evidence of technology that wouldn't be invented for over a century. But the smartphone reflection was only the beginning. As Professor Hawthorne continued his painstaking examination of the photograph, he began to notice other anomalies. In the background, barely visible through a window, he could make out what appeared to be the shape of a modern automobile parked on the street outside. The vehicle's silhouette was sleek and streamlined, completely unlike the horse-drawn carriages that would have been typical in 1892. Even more disturbing was what he found when he examined the wedding guests themselves more carefully. While their clothing appeared perfectly period-appropriate from a distance, under extreme magnification, he could see details that were impossible for the 1890s. One gentleman appeared to be wearing what looked distinctly like a modern digital wristwatch beneath his formal white gloves. The timepiece caught the light in a way that suggested an electronic display, rather than the mechanical pocket watches that would have been standard for the era. A lady in the back row, dressed in an elegant Victorian gown, appeared to have something in her ear that looked remarkably like a modern wireless earphone or hearing aid. The device was nearly invisible, but under Professor Hawthorne's powerful magnification equipment, its modern design was unmistakable. But the detail that finally made Professor Hawthorne scream, a sound that echoed through the empty halls of the history department at 11 p.m., was what he discovered when he examined the bride's bouquet. I need you to brace yourself for what I'm about to tell you. If this story is already making your heart race, if you're feeling that mixture of fascination and terror, drop a comment right now and tell me, do you believe that some photographs can capture more than just what's visible to the naked eye? Because what Professor Hawthorne found in that bouquet will haunt you forever. Hidden among the traditional Victorian flowers in the bride's bouquet, roses, baby's breath, and ivy that were all perfectly appropriate for an 1890s wedding, was a single flower that shouldn't exist. Under extreme magnification, Professor Hawthorne could clearly identify a hybrid orchid variety that wasn't developed until 1987. The orchid was small and partially hidden behind the other flowers, but its distinctive petal pattern and coloration were unmistakable to someone with Professor Hawthorne's expertise in historical botany. He had written papers on Victorian floral arrangements and knew with absolute certainty that this particular orchid cultivar had been created using genetic modification techniques nearly a century after this photograph was supposedly taken. The implications were staggering. Either this was the most elaborate and sophisticated hoax in the history of photography, or something had gone fundamentally wrong with the normal flow of time on this wedding day in 1892. Professor Hawthorne spent the next week consumed by the photograph, barely eating or sleeping, as he conducted test after test, trying to find some rational explanation for what he was seeing. He consulted with colleagues in chemistry, physics, and photography, but none could explain how such anomalies could exist in an authentically aged photograph from the Victorian era. On the seventh night of his investigation, Professor Hawthorne made a discovery that would drive him to the edge of madness. Using a new digital enhancement technique, he was able to reveal additional details in the shadowy areas of the photograph that had previously been invisible. In the corner of the image, partially obscured by the heavy Victorian curtains, stood an additional figure that he hadn't noticed before. This person wasn't dressed in Victorian clothing at all. Instead, they wore what appeared to be a modern business suit, complete with a contemporary necktie and what looked like modern dress shoes. The figure was holding something in their hands that appeared to be a tablet or laptop computer, its screen glowing with what looked distinctly like a digital display. The person appeared to be taking notes or recording data about the wedding scene. But the most disturbing aspect of this hidden figure was their face. When Professor Hawthorne enhanced the image to its maximum resolution, he could see that the person was looking directly into the camera with an expression of calm awareness, as if they knew they were being photographed and didn't care. The figure's eyes seemed to be staring directly at Professor Hawthorne himself, across more than 100 years of time. That night, Professor Hawthorne began experiencing what he later described as temporal displacement episodes. He would find himself standing in his office with no memory of how he had gotten there, holding objects he didn't remember picking up, with hours of time seemingly missing from his memory. During one of these episodes, he discovered that someone had left additional photographs on his desk, images that showed the same wedding party from different angles, revealing even more impossible details. This is where the story takes a turn that will shake you to your core. If you're following along, if you're as terrified and fascinated as Professor Hawthorne was, I need you to share this with someone right now, because what these additional photographs revealed will change how you see reality forever. The new photographs showed the wedding party from multiple perspectives, as if someone had been moving around the room taking pictures throughout the ceremony. But these weren't additional photographs from 1892. They were clearly modern digital images, shot with contemporary equipment, but somehow showing the exact same Victorian wedding scene. In these modern images, Professor Hawthorne could see details that had been hidden in the original 1892 photograph. The figure in the business suit was clearly visible, no longer obscured by curtains. There were other modern figures as well, people in contemporary clothing standing among the Victorian wedding guests as if they belonged there. But the most shocking revelation was that these modern figures appeared to be aware of each other in ways that the Victorian guests were not. While the 1890s wedding party maintained their formal, posed positions, the modern figures moved freely, communicated with each other, and seemed to be conducting some kind of systematic observation or study of the historical scene. Professor Hawthorne realized that he was looking at evidence of some kind of time travel research project or temporal observation experiment. The 1892 wedding wasn't just being photographed. It was being studied by visitors from the future who had somehow gained access to the past. But the implications went even deeper than that. The presence of modern objects in the original 1892 photograph suggested that these temporal visitors weren't just observing. They were interacting with and influencing historical events. the smartphone reflection, the modern car visible through the window, the contemporary wristwatch, the wireless earphone, and the genetically modified orchid weren't anomalies or accidents. They were evidence that the past was being systematically altered by people from the future. As this realization sank in, Professor Hawthorne began to understand that his discovery of these anomalies might not be accidental either. Someone or something wanted him to find this evidence. The photographs had been delivered to him specifically, wrapped with minimal documentation that would ensure they reached someone with the expertise to recognize their significance. He was being recruited or tested by the same forces that had infiltrated this Victorian wedding over a century ago. The proof came when Professor Hawthorne discovered a note tucked behind the frame of one of the additional photographs. Written in modern handwriting on contemporary paper, the note read, "Professor Hawthorne, you understand now. Your expertise has been valuable. Report to the address below, at midnight on Friday, if you wish to learn more. Come alone. Tell no one. The timeline depends on your discretion." The address was for a location in London that Professor Hawthorne knew well. A building that had been demolished in 1987 to make way for a modern office complex. "We're approaching the moment of absolute truth, and I need to know you're ready for what comes next. If this story is making your pulse race, if you're questioning everything you think you know about time and reality, hit that follow button and tell me in the comments. Would you go to that impossible address? Would you risk everything to learn the truth?" Despite every instinct telling him to flee, Professor Hawthorne's scientific curiosity compelled him to investigate. On the designated Friday night, he drove to London and found himself standing in front of the modern office building that had replaced the address mentioned in the note. But as midnight approached, something extraordinary happened. The building began to shimmer and fade, like a mirage dissolving in the desert heat. In its place, the original Victoria structure slowly materialized, solid and real and absolutely impossible. Professor Hawthorne watched in amazement as gas streetlights flickered to life where modern LED fixtures had been moments before. Horse-drawn carriages appeared on the street where cars had been parked. The very air seemed to change, becoming thick with the coal smoke and industrial odors of 19th century London. He had somehow stepped backward in time, or time had somehow stepped forward to meet him. A figure emerged from the Victorian building, a woman dressed in contemporary clothing, who seemed completely at ease in this temporal anomaly. She introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, and Professor Hawthorne gasped when he recognized her name. Dr. Chen was the archaeologist whose discovery of temporal anomalies in an 1884 photograph had made headlines in academic circles years earlier. "Professor Hawthorne," she said with a smile that held secrets spanning centuries. "Welcome to the Chronos Archive. We've been waiting for you." Dr. Chen led him inside the impossible building, through rooms that existed in multiple time periods. Simultaneously, Victorian furniture occupied the same space as modern computers, and people dressed in clothing from different eras worked side by side on projects that seemed to involve manipulating the fundamental nature of time itself. "What you discovered in the 1892 wedding photograph," Dr. Chen explained as they walked through corridors that defied physics, "was evidence of Project Timeline, a research initiative that has been running for over 2 centuries. We study the development of human consciousness across different temporal periods by inserting observers and recording devices into historical events." Professor Hawthorne learned that the Chronos Archive was staffed by researchers recruited from throughout history, people who had demonstrated the ability to recognize temporal anomalies and who possessed the intellectual capacity to understand the implications of temporal manipulation. "But why?" Professor Hawthorne asked, still reeling from everything he was seeing and learning. "Why interfere with history at all?" Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. "Because history has already been interfered with, Professor. There are forces, entities that exist outside normal time, that have been manipulating human development for millennia. Our project exists to study these manipulations, to understand their purpose, and potentially to defend against them." She led him to a viewing room where wall-mounted screens showed live feeds from historical events across multiple time periods. Professor Hawthorne watched in amazement as modern observers, invisible to historical participants, documented everything, from medieval battles to Renaissance art creation to Victorian scientific discoveries. "Every major advancement in human civilization," Dr. Chen continued, "has been influenced by these temporal entities. They guide technological development, influence artistic creation, and shape social evolution in ways that serve their unknown agenda." The 1892 wedding photograph that was sent to you contains evidence of one of our monitoring operations. We were documenting what appeared to be a routine Victorian wedding that had been infiltrated by the temporal entities. What looked like an innocent family celebration was actually a carefully orchestrated event designed to influence the genetic development of specific family bloodlines. Professor Hawthorne stared at the screens, showing impossible scenes of temporal manipulation and interference. How long has this been going on? Since the beginning of recorded history, Dr. Chen replied. Possibly longer. The entities that we're studying don't experience time the way humans do. To them, past, present, and future are all accessible simultaneously. They can influence events in our past to create changes in our present, or modify our present to ensure specific outcomes in our future. Your discovery of the anomalies in the wedding photograph was no accident, Professor. You're chosen because your expertise and analytical skills make you valuable to our research efforts. But more importantly, you're chosen because the temporal entities have taken a particular interest in your family lineage. The words hit Professor Hawthorne like a physical blow. My family lineage. Dr. Chen nodded gravely. The bride in the 1892 photograph was your great-great-grandmother, Professor. The wedding you've been studying was your own family history. The temporal entities have been manipulating the genetic and social development of your ancestral line for over 130 years, guiding events to ensure that you would be born with a specific combination of intellectual abilities and psychological characteristics they require. You weren't recruited by us, Professor Hawthorne. You were bred for this purpose. This is the moment where everything Professor Hawthorne believed about his life, his identity, and his purpose gets completely shattered. If you're feeling that same sense of vertigo, that same mixture of terror and fascination, let me know in the comments. And make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will determine not just Professor Hawthorne's fate, but the future of human consciousness itself. The revelation that his entire existence had been orchestrated by non-human entities operating outside of normal time nearly drove Professor Hawthorne to complete mental breakdown. Everything he had believed about his life, his career choice, his expertise in Victorian photography, even his personality traits, had been carefully engineered over generations to serve the agenda of beings he couldn't understand. But Dr. Chen wasn't finished with her revelations. The temporal entities aren't the only forces manipulating human history. Professor, there's something else. Something we call the correction protocol. She led him deeper into the archive, to a heavily secured area, where the most sensitive research was conducted. Here, Professor Hawthorne was shown evidence that made his discovery of the wedding photograph anomalies seem almost mundane by comparison. Throughout history, Dr. Chen explained, there have been individuals who developed the ability to perceive temporal manipulation. People like yourself who notice things that shouldn't exist in historical records. Most of these people are eliminated or discredited before they can share their discoveries. But some are recruited, like you and me, and a very few develop abilities that go beyond just perception. They become capable of actual temporal manipulation themselves. Professor Hawthorne was shown photographs and documents spanning centuries, all containing evidence of humans who had somehow gained the ability to influence time itself. Medieval monks who could predict future events with impossible accuracy. Renaissance artists who painted scenes from times they had never witnessed. Victorian inventors who developed technologies decades ahead of their time. These individuals, Dr. Chen continued, represent an evolutionary leap in human consciousness. They're developing abilities that match those of the temporal entities, and the entities are terrified of this development. The correction protocol is their response, a systematic effort to prevent humans from developing temporal abilities. They identify individuals with the potential for temporal manipulation, and they eliminate them from history, not just killed, completely erased from the timeline, as if they had never existed. Professor Hawthorne felt a chill of recognition, like the researchers who discovered temporal anomalies and then disappeared from all records. Exactly, but the protocol isn't just targeting individual researchers anymore. They're targeting entire genetic lineages that show potential for temporal abilities. They're essentially trying to breed temporal sensitivity out of the human species before we can develop enough to challenge their control over our history. Your family line, Professor, represents one of the strongest concentrations of temporal sensitivity genes in the human population. The 1892 wedding wasn't just monitored by the entities, it was orchestrated by them to ensure that your lineage would develop the specific combination of abilities they need for their research projects. But something went wrong with their plan. Instead of creating a compliant research subject, They've created someone with the potential to develop actual temporal manipulation abilities. The wedding photograph anomalies you discovered weren't just evidence of their presence. They were evidence of your own unconscious temporal influence. The room seemed to spin around Professor Hawthorne as the implications sank in. You're saying I caused those anomalies? Not consciously, Dr. Chen replied. But your temporal sensitivity is so strong that your focused attention on the photograph actually influenced the past. Your examination of the 1892 image somehow reached backward through time and created the very anomalies you were studying. You didn't just discover evidence of temporal manipulation, Professor Hawthorne. You created it. The revelation was too much. Professor Hawthorne felt his grip on reality beginning to slip as he realized that his entire understanding of cause and effect, of past and present, was fundamentally flawed. The photograph hadn't contained evidence of time travel. His study of the photograph had created the time travel. But Dr. Chen wasn't finished. There's more. Professor, the entities have realized what you are, what you're capable of becoming. The correction protocol has been activated specifically to target you. They're coming to erase you from the timeline completely. But you have a choice. You can work with us to develop your abilities, to learn to consciously control your temporal influence. Together, we might be able to defend against the entities and prevent them from controlling human development. Or you can return to your normal life and hope that the correction protocol doesn't find you. But Professor, I have to tell you, once you've seen what you've seen, once you've developed the level of temporal sensitivity you've achieved, there's no going back. You're already too dangerous to them to be allowed to exist. Professor Hawthorne looked around the impossible archive at the screens, showing temporal manipulation across centuries, at the evidence that everything he had believed about reality was wrong. His choice would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the future of human evolution and consciousness. We've reached the ultimate moment of decision, where Professor Hawthorne has to choose between safety and power, between ignorance and terrible knowledge. If you've made it this far, if this story has completely captured your imagination, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, follow this channel because there are more stories like this that will blow your mind. Second, share this with everyone you know because this information might be more important than you realize. And third, tell me in the comments what would you choose. Would you embrace your temporal abilities or try to return to a normal life? Professor Hawthorne made his choice in that moment, standing in the archives surrounded by evidence of humanity's hidden history and potential future. He chose evolution over safety, knowledge over ignorance, power over comfort. I'll learn, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was committing to. I'll develop these abilities and help you fight against the entities. But his decision triggered an immediate response. Alarms began blaring throughout the archive as monitoring systems detected what Dr. Chen called a correction surge. The temporal entities had sensed his decision and were mobilizing the protocol to eliminate him. We have minutes, maybe less, Dr. Chen shouted over the alarms. They're going to try to erase you from the timeline, starting with your birth and working forward through your life. Every moment you've ever existed is about to be systematically deleted. Professor Hawthorne felt a strange sensation, as if parts of his memory were beginning to fade. His childhood memories became fuzzy, then started disappearing entirely. His university years grew dim and uncertain. The protocol was working backward through his life, erasing him from history. But as his past disappeared, something unexpected happened. Instead of ceasing to exist, Professor Hawthorne began to exist more intensely in the present moment. As the entities deleted his history, his consciousness became unmoored from linear time and began to experience past, present, and future simultaneously. He could see his own birth, his childhood, his academic career, and his discovery of the wedding photograph, all happening at once. But he could also see events that hadn't happened yet. His development of temporal manipulation abilities, his role in humanity's defense against the entities, and possible futures where human consciousness evolved beyond anything the entities could control. This is impossible, Dr. Chen breathed, watching as Professor Hawthorne began to glow with an energy that existed outside normal physics. The protocol should have erased you completely. Professor Hawthorne understood what was happening. The entities had made a crucial error. By trying to erase someone with developing temporal abilities, they had actually freed him from the constraints of linear existence. He no longer existed within normal time. He existed throughout all time simultaneously. He had become what the entities were most afraid of, a human with temporal powers that matched their own. Using his new abilities, Professor Hawthorne reached backward through time and began to reverse the damage the entities had done to human development. He restored the erased researchers, recovered the hidden discoveries, and revealed the suppressed evidence of temporal manipulation to consciousness across multiple time periods. The entities fought back, trying to contain the temporal disruption he was causing, but Professor Hawthorne had advantages they hadn't anticipated. His human consciousness, evolved over millennia of linear existence, gave him an understanding of cause and effect that their nonlinear awareness lacked. Where they saw all possible outcomes simultaneously, he could focus on specific desired outcomes and work systematically to achieve them. Where they experienced all time periods as equally real, he could prioritize certain moments and give them greater significance in the flow of history. The battle between Professor Hawthorne and the temporal entities raged across centuries, invisible to most of humanity, but reshaping the fundamental structure of historical development. Ancient discoveries that had been suppressed were suddenly remembered. Scientific breakthroughs that had been prevented were retroactively achieved. Artistic works that had been erased were restored to their proper place in cultural history. But the most important change was in human consciousness itself, as Professor Hawthorne used his temporal abilities to restore humanity's hidden history. People throughout time began to develop their own temporal sensitivity. The genetic potential that the entities had tried to suppress began to manifest in individuals across multiple time periods. The result was a cascade of temporal awakening that the entities could not contain or control. Humans throughout history began to perceive and interact with time in ways that had previously been impossible. The rigid structure of linear time began to give way to a more fluid, conscious relationship between human awareness and temporal reality. Professor Hawthorne had achieved something unprecedented. He had initiated an evolutionary leap in human consciousness that operated backward through time, affecting not just the future, but also the past and present simultaneously. But victory came with responsibility. As the first human to fully develop temporal manipulation abilities, Professor Hawthorne became the guardian of humanity's temporal development. He would need to guide and protect other humans as they developed similar abilities, while continuing to defend against any entities or forces that might try to control or manipulate human consciousness. Standing in the archive, which now existed simultaneously across multiple time periods, Professor Hawthorne looked at the screens, showing human temporal development accelerating throughout history. Children in Victorian England were unconsciously influencing photographs. Renaissance artists were painting scenes from future time periods. Modern researchers were discovering evidence of temporal anomalies in historical records. Humanity was awakening to its temporal potential, and there was no force in any time period that could prevent that awakening. Dr. Chen, her own temporal abilities now beginning to manifest, smiled as she watched Professor Hawthorne examine new photographs, arriving from across history, images that showed humans throughout time beginning to interact consciously with temporal reality. What happens now? She asked. Professor Hawthorne looked at the endless possibilities spreading across all time periods, at the infinite potential of human consciousness freed from the constraints of linear existence. Now, he said, we help humanity learn to swim in the ocean of time. You've just experienced one of the most mind-bending true stories of human potential and temporal manipulation ever revealed. If this journey has changed how you think about consciousness, time, and human potential, I need you to take action right now. Follow this channel, because there are more incredible stories waiting to be told. Share this with everyone in your life because this information might be the key to humanity's next evolutionary step. And tell me in the comments, do you think you have temporal sensitivity? Have you ever noticed things in old photographs that shouldn't be there? Your experiences could be more important than you realize. The truth is that Professor Hawthorne's story might not be as fictional as you think. There are people throughout history who have noticed temporal anomalies, who have discovered evidence of impossible things in historical records, who have experienced glimpses of non-linear time. And if you're one of those people, if you've ever felt that time is more flexible than everyone believes, if you've ever noticed things that others miss in old photographs or historical documents, then you might be part of humanity's temporal awakening. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge? Will you dismiss it as imagination, or will you begin to develop your potential? Will you join the growing community of people who understand that consciousness and time are more connected than anyone realizes? The choice is yours. But remember, once you start to see the evidence of temporal manipulation, once you begin to understand that reality is far more malleable than it appears, you can never go back to seeing the world the same way. The temporal awakening has begun. The only question is whether you'll be part of it, or whether you'll continue to live within the illusion of linear time. What will you choose?